You know as well as I do, indeed you've written about it, that since the Prophet Muhammad's death, bloody wars of domination have been raging in the world of Islam. And, until we Muslims are willing to own up to that fact, I just don't see a whole lot of hope for stability, never mind accountability and democracy. And I think that if we were willing to own up to that fact, we would have much more legitimacy calling out the West on the barriers that it's throwing up, that it's erecting to what we will have then demonstrated, not just asserted, actually demonstrated are our democratic aspirations as Muslims. One other thing I will quickly say about all of this, and that is that, you also state that there's a great deal of diversity within the Muslim world, that Senegal simply cannot be compared in many ways to Saudi Arabia, Egypt to Indonesia. I mean, in all kinds of ways, of course, that's true. But only a couple of weeks ago, the Muslim majority countries of this world showed just how monolithic they actually are. A couple of weeks ago, the UN's own Human Rights Council, for what that is worth, adopted a resolution against the so-called defamation of religion. Now, it wasn't just religion that they were trying to protect, it was the religion of Islam. This resolution was introduced by Pakistan on behalf of the 56-member Organization of Islamic Conference, the OIC. And this is a union of Muslim-majority countries around the world. I'm sad to say, really sad to say, that every member of the Organization of Islamic Conference, except one, voted foursquare for this resolution. The only one that did not only abstained, and that was Nigeria. In effect, it was a tacit support for this resolution. So that meant Malaysia and Indonesia and Senegal, all of these places that are supposed to be so much different from the Arab world, voted for this resolution, knowing full well how vague the resolution is, and that what it actually allows authoritarian or authoritarian elements even within democratic governments in the Islamic world to do is further quash the voices, particularly the dissident voices of Islam. But worse than simply, being able to now further quash these already fragile rights, they can do it under the guise of Islamic law. This is why it is simply not good enough to say there is such incredible diversity within the Muslim world. That diversity, we Muslims are not yet willing to show to the world. And I therefore cannot blame non-Muslims for wondering why it is that you perceive the world of Islam in one way and they perceive it in another. Frankly, we don't give non-Muslims a whole lot of evidence to show how multifaceted we are.
Well, I think a couple things. One, I don't think that the fact that the OIC voted for the Anti-Religious Defamation Act, the resolution in the UN, says anything about the countries whatsoever. And I do think it's unfair to refer to it as specifically focused on Islam, though certainly the argument arose after the Danish cartoon controversy. But, there is no sort of pan-Islamism based on this idea that you shouldn't defamate the Prophet Muhammad. And in that sense, the Indonesian council, I think, would just as easily favor an article like that, an international article like that, any more than this, as much as the Senegal council does. But I don't think that that sort of is an indication of a common idea of either religious oppression or religious orthodoxy by any means. Secondly, there is this sort of really unfair and somewhat disingenuous argument that is made quite often about sort of, Islam's bloody past, as though during, the imperial era of Islam, when the entire known world was embroiled in bloody imperial wars of religion, from Zoroastrian, Sasanian Iran to Byzantine Orthodox Christian Europe to the Abbasid empires, the Fatimid empires, the Safavid empires. This is a period of empires, and empires make war with each other, and empires are brutal to any kind of heterodoxy within their own regions. So if you're going to talk about this horrible sort of bloodletting amongst Muslims for the past 14 centuries and somehow compare that to what is taking place today in the very sort of complex socio-political conflicts taking place within and among nation states, then I guess you're going to have to compare the Inquisition or the Crusades to the conflicts taking place in, let's say, Ireland, or the conflicts taking place within Spain. Let's figure out a way to sort of not just bring some perspective to history and the way that history is often formed, particularly in the West, about the rise of Islam, which I think is really, has a lot of misconceptions and falsehoods to it. In the same way that one could make the argument that Muslims are just as much responsible, if not more responsible, for the current state of affairs, particularly in the Middle East, as American or European foreign policy or meddling in that region since colonialism has. I think you could just as easily say, well, in some ways, you could trace this back to the Crusades, or you could trace it back to the rise of Islam through the conquest of Europe, etc. I don't think that that's very helpful. I think the important thing for us to focus on here is precisely why there is this sort of lack of religious and political and economic and social development in the region, to put that fairly on the shoulders of the leaders of the region, as well as the foreign powers that, through their cultural hegemony, through their economic interests, policy, have more often than not been on the wrong side of this internal debate than on the right side, and then to figure out how it is that these external powers can help in bringing about a movement of reform in this region. It's not unusual to not hear the internal nuanced debates taking place in the Muslim world over how to reconcile traditional Islamic values and traditions with the realities of the modern world. Everywhere I go, people ask me the same question I'm sure they ask Irshad. Where is the voice of moderate Islam? How come we don't hear you? How come we don't hear this, etc.? I was in Iran a couple of years ago, and an Iranian pulled me aside and said, "Where do you live?" I said, "I lived in America." And he said, "What's it like living in a theocracy?" Now, I had to explain to them that if an American heard an Iranian say that, their head would explode. But let me tell you what Iranians hear, and they've got CNN and Al Jazeera, and they've got every satellite channel that you could possibly imagine. What they hear is Pat Robertson. What they hear is the sort of neoconservative, muscular, nationalistic version of Christianity called dominionism.
But you don't want us to believe that Ahmadinejad has as much power as Pat Robertson in Iran.
Oh no, Pat Robertson has way more power than Ahmadinejad has. Far,
you're going to have to explain
power.
That one to me.
Well, I think this is a wonderful indication of this. The president of Iran is a completely powerless figure. He does not control the army. He is not in control of the militias. He makes not a single foreign policy decision. He's not even allowed to introduce legislation into parliament. He is not in charge of the budget of the country. He makes no decisions of any influence or concern in that country whatsoever. And let me tell you something. Everybody in this government, in the American government, knows this. Why do I say that? Because we spent the last 8 years warding off the attempts by a very moderate, very liberal, pro-Western president, Mohammad Khatami, who spent 8 years reaching out to America, and we refused to reach back because, and this is a legitimate reason, because what's the point in reaching out to someone who has no power, no influence, no authority in a government, who makes no decisions whatsoever?